So do Badders. We don't often get people back. Probably not so soon as well. And we basically, as soon as we finished interviewing with Tim, we said, Tim, we want to continue this. We want more. And we've had quite a bit of response from the listeners. And Renee McGregor, who's been on a few times, she had a few things she wanted to kind of to raise as well. So Renee may be jumping in the conversation later, but one of the aspects of Tim's background that I personally find really interesting, that I don't think's really been discussed massively in podcasts before, or really addressed with as the main issue, is just his relationship with the scientific community, and the fact that Tim has been the darling and the devil, depending on the time. So to tell us that part of the story that I don't think we covered at all. Welcome back on the podcast, Tim Noakes.
Fantastic to be back. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your
I mean, would you say that's a fair interpretation of?
It takes insight to put together what you said, because most people sort of gloss over that and they don't understand what actually happened to me. So let's go back. As you said, I was the darling of sports science. So I was responsible really for starting sports science and sports medicine and advancing it in South Africa. And during that time, I was the golden boy, and I could do nothing wrong. And so when I look back at the press cuttings about me during that period of my life, they were all positive. They were always positive. I don't think I ever had any negative comments.
And at that time in your life, like, what does that look like in terms of the analysis of what you're doing, what pressures there are on you to research different things, what interests you, how things are published and shared, just to give, because I think a lot of people don't really understand what it's like to be a professor in the sports science community, and your relation with athletes, media, and publications.
So I think the most stressful point for any scientist is to get funding. And that's the key, because if you don't have funding, you can't do research, obviously. So you're always looking for relationships. And I was very fortunate that I had relationships with people who didn't really try to influence me in any great way. But that's all changed now. Now you get funding to do research that's really propaganda for the company that's funding you. And so you have to be very, very cautious when you see that company X funded your research or the research, and then the research finds in favor of company X's product.
And is that because of a cut in funding to universities, or just because expansion means they want more money coming in?
Definitely, certainly in South Africa, the funding has dried up, and I think in Great Britain it's the same. That there's much less funding to do research, and the funding tends to go to the popular discipline of the day. And sports science was never a hugely popular discipline. And I think, for example, if you take the British example, going into the London Olympic Games, there would have been plenty of money for sports science and sports medicine, because the politicians want to make an impression. But the moment that the games are over, then the funding gets cut. I think Britain has been they've tended to continue to funding sports science, but in many countries, the funding has been reduced, and certainly in Australia, the funding was reduced. So that's your first pressure, is to get the money to do the funding. And with that, those are the real pressures, because now you have to be, are you an honest scientist or are you a dishonest scientist? And I was an honest scientist, and I am an honest scientist, and that's why I drew antagonism. The book Waterlogged, which talks about how over-drinking, and exposed the industry for forcing or encouraging athletes to overdrink. And we knew that was going to cause death, and we warned the industry and we warned the population that if you're going to drink to excess during exercise, there will be deaths, particularly amongst female runners in ultra-distance events, and predictably that happened.
And Tim, at that time, had there been research done that was presented in a way that looked as if it was solid academic research to suggest that you needed to drink huge amounts?
Oh, yes. The way they distorted it was they developed a new disease called dehydration. And dehydration is a physiological state in which your body water content is slightly reduced. Of course, it can be extremely reduced, and then you get symptoms, but the only symptom you get from dehydration is thirst. That's it. If you're not thirsty, you're not dehydrated, or you're not seriously dehydrated. Then they made that you could be dehydrated by a tiny amount and you would develop heat stroke. And we were the first to show that that was nonsensical. People run marathons and get severely dehydrated, and they're not at any risk of heat stroke.
And why? Like, how does that research then become prevalent? Because I think we often hear, about peer reviewed, and to get published, you need a certain element of other professors to actually try and find holes in the studies. So is it because at times a lot of things are published without having that rigor?
Yeah, so what happens is very simple. If I want to sell a product, what I do is I identify the scientists who I can influence. And those scientists usually aren't the top league. They come from the smaller universities. And I start to offer them lots of money. And then we form an institute where we study whatever the question is. Maybe it's Carbohydrate during exercise institute. And I put lots of funding in behind that. And then I start to work with the big names in the sport, or in the sports science, as this case. And I get them then to give all the lectures. They go on tours and they tell you that, carbohydrates are very important for exercise. And then when the guidelines are written, because these companies like to influence large organizations like the American College of Sports Medicine, the British College, I guess, whatever that is called, but the British Sports Sciences, they have direct influence, and to survive, they need money, and they get money from the industry. So then what happens is the guidelines for drinking or for nutrition during exercise are written by the people who are funded by the industries that will benefit from the guidelines. And so it's no longer about truth. It's about promoting a product and promoting the propaganda that will sell that product. And it's very easy as a scientist to set up experiments that will prove that the product works. It's not difficult to do that. But
and
that's
is that just by not doing blind testing, or to what?
So let's give you an example. Maybe you know that I promote a rather higher fat diet. If you come to my laboratory and you see me there, and I will speak to you about, we're testing the high fat diet. We really think it's fantastic. You're gonna really have an amazing exercise performance. Now you get on the bicycle or the treadmill, and I'm watching you. Do you think it's not going to impact your influence, your outcome? Of course it is. So what they do is you go to the Sports Science Institute for your testing, and then they give you the sports drink, and they test you. And do you think you're not going to find that sports drink works? Because on the wall there's an advert saying this sports drink will make you go 1% faster in the Ironman or in a marathon. Do you think that's not going to influence you? Of course it influences you. So that's the subtle ways. I mean, there are more less subtle ways. People actually cheat the data. That happens. So you just have to be very wary that what you're reading may not be the truth.
And before we come back to kind of the continuation of your story, do you think we've just fundamentally got a broken system now because of lack of funding, and that it can't be changed? Or do you believe that there is a real that scientists shouldn't allow this? It actually comes down to individual choice, and the fact that doctors take an oath. Why scientists in some way should be adhering to the rules of science and testing, and is there anything we can do about that?
I'm not sure. There are moves to try to clean up science. But let's remember, sports science is small fry. It's really an irrelevant science. But when you talk about the pharmacological drugs that are prescribed, that's where the real distortions occur. And I simply do not trust anything that comes out of pharmacologically based research or of new products. I just absolutely don't trust it, because that is so distorted and so dishonest. But and that you simply can't trust it. Can you change it? No, because unfortunately the people who are running it are utterly corrupt. So, people talk about that. There's one lovely book, Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime. And that's it. The pharmaceutical industry is organized crime. And once you understand that, then you realize there's no hope to clean that up because the amounts of money that are available. But let's go back to sports science. By and large, 90% of the sports scientists are absolutely honest. And let me just make one other point, that when scientists differ, it's because we have different models which we start from. So if, on the other hand, you go through the literature and you decide the biological model is different, it's not that muscle glycogen is critical for your athletic performance, then you'll say, well, actually, it doesn't matter what you eat, whether it's carbs or fats during exercise. And so when people look at the same information, they can interpret it totally differently. And that doesn't make either of them dishonest. They are both honest according to their model. And that's very important. Where the dishonesty comes in is when they distort the information to support the interpretation that they want.
And so, to a certain extent, is there an element of depending on what type of physiology the individual has as well? Would that come into it as well? If someone's fat adaptive, if someone's not fat adaptive, if someone's Oh,
absolutely. So let's just go on to the diets and health. I can assure you that every single person who's a scientist or a doctor who's promoting a low carbohydrate diet, it's because it worked for them. Because you have to break from the mainstream, you have to find it works for you first. You won't break from the mainstream if what you're doing works for you. If you follow the mainstream ideas and they work for you, there's absolutely no change. If they don't work for you and you try something new and you find it works, then you break from the mainstream. But literally, that's a very good example. So let's say I'm a Kenyan marathon runner and I'm raised on carbohydrates and I set the world record. I'm never going to question that wasn't the reason. I won the world records because I was eating a high carbohydrate diet. You've got no reason to question it. Why would you question success? But if you fail, then you might start questioning it, and then you might change. But you have to have the personal experiences, and so I would argue that if there is a genetic basis, that some people burn fat better and they need to be fat adapted, others need to be carbohydrate adapted. The only way you'll ever find out is to do it for yourself. It's no good just because such and such an athlete did it on a high carbohydrate and another athlete did it on a high fat diet, or the laboratory studies say you must eat a high-fat diet, or the laboratory studies say you must eat a high-carbohydrate diet. In the end of the day, you may be totally different, and you need to test it for yourself. So I agree. There's always a possibility that you're genetically different, and you won't respond as the rest of the population respond.
Well, kind of coming back to when you first discovered hypernatremia, and what impact did your findings have, and how was that when you've talked about this system where there's institutes, then there's advice given by the governing bodies or health rules. How was that information received then, and how did that impact on these previously thought beliefs?
Well, fortunately in South Africa, we didn't have any deaths from hyponatremia, and the Comrades Marathon is designed to cause hyponatremic encephalopathy and death if people follow that way. And fortunately, we'd never had any deaths in the Comrades. So for some reason, the South African public got the message not to overdrink. It wasn't that my message was getting through as the sole solution. There was still a lot of advertising about drinking and preventing dehydration and so on. So it wasn't as if that was an exclusive message that was going out to the runners. But somehow we saved it and the runners didn't die. In America, it didn't work. That message didn't get out.
And I think what year was that, Tim? What year did you first?
Well, we worked out by 1985 already that overdrinking is a problem. But we could only prove it scientifically by 1991. From 1991 onwards, there should never have been any deaths. But in fact, the deaths just started
And
in the
why did
90s
it take? Out of interest, why did it take so long from that perception to the trials and the proof?
because medicine takes 10 or 20 years for a new idea to break through. That's it's just that is the way it is.
Is it the idea to break through, or is it to test and prove?
So what happens is that the people who are promoting, the authorities who are promoting the wrong ideas, have to die off. And once they die off, they're faced.
From the scientific community, would you say then? Because I guess Gatorade are always going to be promoting their Buy Gatorade message.
That's correct. So the scientists have to change. You know, as a classic example, so I've been promoting that diabetes is a reversible disease and it's caused by our choice of foods. And I've been promoting it for 10 years, and all the problems that arose in my life in the medical profession was because of that statement. Yesterday, I get the news that my university and my hospital have finally realized 10 years later that diabetes is a problem, that 1/3 of all the beds in the hospital are full of people with diabetes. And they said, obviously, we're not doing something right. I wonder what we could be doing wrong. And they're now finally saying, imagine if nutrition does reverse diabetes and prevent it. Maybe we've got it wrong on nutrition, but that's 10 years. And
but because I guess the frustrating thing from what you're saying is, from my perception of how scientists should operate and how it's perceived that things are tested, is that you look at data, you try and find proof, you try and find truth, and then you may have theories that you try and test, but what is it? Why is it that these individuals then who have let's take, because the diabetes we're in the process of that now, but the drinking one has been proven, everyone's accepted that, it other than probably Gatorade still. Like, why are the individuals who have been championing that you need to drink more, do they come out aggressively attacking your stance, or do they just plow on regardless, or do they shut down? Or like, why is it that scientists, when there is this idea of peer assessment, aren't looking at new data and then trying to actually move things forward rather than defend a position?
Yeah, because defending your position is the only way you can survive. That's the reality. And so if your funder is promoting the idea that you must drink lots of fluids during exercise, unfortunately, that's all you'll ever be allowed to say. And it happened to me. The minute I changed and said, you shouldn't be taking water so much during exercise, or carbohydrates aren't good for you, I lost all my funding immediately. So,
who were your funders back then?
Well, the one funder was a large medical insurance company who was promoting the wellness of the population. And I became their spokesperson and their blue-eyed boy, promoting a high carbohydrate, lots of cereals and grains diet. And when I said that I'd gone off cereals and grains, that was the final straw. And they reduced their funding over 2 or 3 years. You know, I owe everything to them, so I could never criticize them. My research took off with them. But
what was their link to it then? Because surely they should just be doing whatever's best for their customers.
That's a question I can't answer, and I can't answer that question. And it's a very important question. And eventually, maybe the question will come out and the answers will come out. But I would have thought that an insurance company would want their people to be healthy, and we can show that if they don't eat sugar, they would be better. If they don't eat an excess of carbohydrates, they'll be better. But they've never promoted that idea, and I have no idea, because I would have thought it would be helpful to them in the long term.
And do you think it was what you were saying, or do you think it was based on other individuals and the fact, because by changing your view, you're in effect calling out everyone else? So do you think it was just the content, or do you think there are other factors to do with actually you're now pulling down all these other people we're involved with?
I think it all comes down financial in the end. That if you threaten an industry, then you'll be taken out. That's essentially what happened to me. So I was charged with unprofessional conduct, but by the Health Professions Council. But actually, what they wanted to do was to shut up any debate. And so, if they could say that I had acted unprofessionally on Twitter, that would have meant that any South African doctor who said anything in public, whether it was in a lecture or wrote in a book or an article or spoke on the radio, if they made any comments about medical issues, they could lose their license to practice. So in the end, it became a power struggle. But I was fighting the nutritionists of South Africa and the dogmas. But behind it was this bigger agenda of making sure that I did not have freedom of speech, and no other doctor in South Africa had freedom of speech. And it's really come to the fore now recently that there are threats that any South African doctor who speaks against the mainstream media, mainstream narrative about COVID can lose his license to practice. So that there's something else that's bigger going on behind it. And we were kind of at the forefront of exposing it.
Well, we'll get on to COVID later, but and in terms of when you first published and even revealed that you were doing these studies, like because you've talked about the council, you've talked about the funder itself, but there are a host of individuals who are your colleagues, are your friends, and your community. Like what's the reaction from them? Have people changed positions as soon as money was being pulled, or have they been caught in the middle of this as well?
So what happened to me was that I was cancelled by the University of Cape Town. The medical faculty released a statement from 4 of the professors, including the Dean of Medicine, who's the most influential person on the medical campus, and the Professor of Medicine, and the person who had overseen my PhD and who everyone knew I had a very tight relationship, and the head of dietetics. So they wrote this letter, which was what we call academic mobbing, because now I was persona non grata for every single person at the medical school. Every single person knew that if they associated with Tim Noakes, their career was in jeopardy because they were going against what the Dean of Medicine had said. And once the Dean of Medicine says something and you now oppose that and you come up for a research position or advance in your career in any way, that's it. You're gone. You're done for.
And
so that's how they do it.
Did you know that was coming? Like, had you had conversations individually with, with your?
I was never warned. I never warned, and I was never asked for my opinion. And in fact, I had given my opinion at the university, and I had spoken, and no one had said, "You're completely wrong. It's absolutely wrong." No one had said that. That this action happened because the university was put under pressure to make sure that they indicated that they disliked me and that I was not a scientist and I wasn't acceptable, that the Health Professions Council could go ahead and say, you see, his own universities rejected him, so therefore he must be a problem.
And did you run into in the corridors into these people? Did you meet them at dinner parties, at colleagues' drinks, or like what were their conversations afterwards?
That's a great question, because the reason I was successful was because I took everything away from the faculty, and we had our own building, which was away from the campus. Fabulous building, fabulous facilities. I had no contact with the faculty. So I never spoke to these people. The professor of medicine and the dean of medicine, they didn't know anything about me. They knew nothing about the research I was doing. They knew nothing about my influence globally or how often I've been cited. They might have known, but it was irrelevant to them. So I never saw them, and I still haven't seen them. And how many years later is it? Well, it's going on 10 years, and I've not seen any of them. Yeah.
And what about other colleagues that you worked with? What happened with them?
Like about 4 or 5 of them stayed with me and helped me through my problems. The rest didn't. They did the opposite. They sided with the dean. And this is despite I raised these people as scientists. I gave them everything they have. But when the pressure came on, they were gone. So what I learned was what Jeffrey Archer wrote. And he said, when you're being isolated and you've got a problem, there are two responses from your so-called friends. The one group will disappear and run away from you, which is 95% of the people. And the other 5% will come and embrace you. And those are the people that you embrace. And so I had people who came to me, particularly my legal team, who literally, I would do absolutely everything. I would lay down my life for them because they did it for me. And they are the real people. And my life has been emboldened and made better because I met those people. And the other people, I don't want to know about them. They must just go and get lost. I don't want to know anything.
Does this include friends who aren't linked to your profession, just individual friends on a personal basis?
No, I think that they by and large supported me. You know, in the end, I had massive support from the average South African who's a bit resistant. They don't want to be pushed around by authorities. So in the end, I had really good support from the average South Africans. So that kept me going because I knew that the people supported me.
And do you get a sense that could this situation, do you truly believe, arise in any British, American, Western university? Or do you think there is, because of the nature that the funding was so based on one private company, that this could happen to you, but couldn't necessarily be replicated in elsewhere?
No, it's replicated everywhere, every minute of the day. So there are many books written on it, and it's happening all the time. So academic research is a very difficult area because you get academic bullying, which is what happened to me, which is rife. You know, and on Twitter you can see how many universities in Britain are involved, and the amount of money they pay to keep the whistleblowers suppressed. So academic bullying, which is essentially what happened to me, is absolutely widespread, and it's worst at the best universities. So I can tell you that scientific research, is the last place you want to be in at the moment. It is such a toxic environment. You don't want to know about it. Now, I didn't believe that when I started science, and it wasn't like that for me originally. We had a great time, and I loved my career. But by the end, things had changed so dramatically that there's absolutely no way I would advise anyone to go into scientific research in a highly competitive environment. It's just not worth it.
And do you think there is a way to decouple,
Yeah.
isn't the right word?
Okay, so let me take it from my profession, from medicine. The only way that you can advance medicine is you have to decouple medicine from the pharmaceutical industry. So if you were to start a new university which did not accept funding from the pharmaceutical industry, you could teach real health. You could get people healthy, because health is all about nutrition and exercise and mental control and so on. But it's got nothing, absolutely nothing to do with medicine, medications. It has nothing to do with pharmaceutical drugs. That is not health. That is disease. Now, medicine is completely regulated and controlled by the pharmaceutical industry. So if I was to go and say, to get healthy, you must stop taking these pills, and you must do decent exercise, and you must eat the right diet, I would be expelled from the standard university, as I was. You have to have a totally new structure, and then it might work. But you'd have to get the money from people who really believed in this and had so much money that they wanted to change the system. The system cannot be changed from inside. It's utterly corrupt, and it's utterly controlled by industry, be it the food industry. We haven't mentioned them. The food industry and the pharmaceutical industry control everything that is taught at medical schools. And because they are so powerful, they've got so much money, and they're so intertwined with the academics that you can't change that.
And within those organizations, because, for example, I've got my own company, and I try and make sure that everything we do is moral. Do you believe that it ties into when companies get too large, actually they can no longer, everything just becomes a decision based on a spreadsheet rather than the actual implications? Or do you think it's to do with shareholder pressure, or do you think that there just is a terrible conflict inherently in pharmaceutical companies? Or where do you think this, because just because companies are giving money doesn't necessarily mean it has to be bad, but where do you think that stems from?
I think once the company's publicly listed and it's on the stock market, the pressure to produce your 10% annual growth is huge, and that's where it starts. And but if you're not publicly listed, then there's not the same pressure to distort the system and sell product and make revenue. So I think that's where it is. It's publicly listed companies, and it's these huge companies, the big pharmas and the big food companies, that are the real problem.
And I know he's not necessarily your favorite man, but do you think initiatives like Bill Gates, who, as you said last time, has invested in Beyond Meats or something similar, there is now a move for these egotistical billionaires to invest in cures, or to try and actually pick the problem in the world and try and fix that and attach their name to it? So, for example, it could be malaria, or it could be various diseases. Do you think that could be a way in which the connection is broken?
Oh, definitely. But unfortunately, the oligarchs in the world, the Bill Gateses, have an agenda for what they want to see the world to become. And it's got nothing to do with your health or my health. And that's the problem. That their agenda is becoming more and more obvious every single day. So, but they absolutely couldn't care less about the health of the world. They've got another agenda. So if
this is where I think we differ, because I genuinely think they want to be known as great people and remembered for years to come. And so actually things like solving malaria is a huge ego trip, which is a good thing for society, that they're focusing on, say, that rather than something else. But
you have to look at the totality of Bill Gates' influence. You can't take an isolated event like malaria. You've got to look at the totality. And you look at the totality, it is all agenda driven, and it has a bad agenda which will work out very badly. And if he succeeds, we won't have this discussion in 10 years' time, because there won't be a free debate like this. You will not be able to speak freely, neither will I. We'll be locked down. It'll be 1984. It'll be George Orwell. We'll have a camera in this room, which will be following everything I do and say. And I will be checked for my credits, social credits. How much meat did I eat this week?
Recording is on.
How far did I travel? Those are the issues. So I agree that you may find reason to think that the oligarchs are helpful. But you've got to look back and you check this COVID, who has really benefited. And the Gates and these people, their wealth has increased 10, 20, 30 billion dollars. And the man in the street is being crushed, absolutely crushed.
Now, Renee has just joined us on video, and actually, you've almost joined at the perfect time, Renee, because Tim and I have just gone on to what most people would view as conspiracy theories, and so I'd love, and Tim, if you're happy for us to, I'd love to park that for after because I'd love to go into that as well. But Renee is one of the people who I felt could best represent, to a certain extent, the other side, but also she had some firm views on things like hormones and wanted to put in some provisos for different diets. So is that right, Renee? Have I done you? And just so you know, Tim and I have turned up on videos because we've been having a terrible time trying to get audio flowing just constantly throughout the interview. which we've struggled on, thankfully. But hey, really, how you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. Yes, it's thanks for having me, and it's lovely to meet you, Tim.
Thanks, Renee. Thank you.
I can't believe you
And
two haven't met before. Actually, you've got so much you'd catch up on, and like so many people you'd know in common.
well, sports science is a small world, but it's also quite a big world, right? So, but obviously, I know of Tim. I don't think anybody in the sports world doesn't know of Tim, to be fair. So yeah, he's probably a bit more well known than I am. But yeah, no, it's really good to be here. So yeah, sorry. Also, David, I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm feeling a bit like, oh, I think it's called December actually, rather
Yeah.
than it being a cold. I think it's just like December is, I don't know. I don't know if you guys find it. I find it a really exhausting and challenging month generally. So,
And I've
um,
not even had 3 weeks of hangovers yet either, so it's going to get worse.
exactly. I haven't had that first night out yet in December, but roll on the weekend. We'll see what happens.
But Tim, the one of the reasons why I thought it'd be interesting to get really on, because last time I'd asked you about hormone regulation when carbohydrates aren't in the diet, and then I said it in a way that sounded like I knew what I was talking about, but clearly had no depth of knowledge in any way about it, and probably completely misrepresented um, something Rini had asked. So, Rini, do you want to explain the area that you're nervous about, I guess, to do with diets and the implications for hormones in particular?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think just to make that really clear, it is an area of concern. It's not saying that the whole population is at risk. Tim, I work in the area of sports nutrition, particularly REDS and eating disorders within sport. And we see a lot of female athletes that come through the clinic that have hypothalamic amenorrhea as a result of underfueling, but actually also a lot of them have, if you were to work out their energy requirements, they're meeting their energy requirements, but actually have gone down the low carb, high fat route. And we've definitely seen some big trends around, particularly in female athletes, where the low intake of carbohydrate availability has a real sort of a direct effect on the production of the hormone T3. And unless we alter this and change this, we then don't get any changes to their overall health and then well-being and performance as well, because I'm sure you're very aware that when someone has low levels, whether that's testosterone or estrogen, that has severe consequences in many aspects of their health, from bone health to immune health to actually cognitive function as well, and mood. So I guess that's where my concern was. It wasn't, I think I did listen to the previous podcast, and I understand that actually our areas of research and interest are slightly different. I think you come at it from more of a general health population now, rather than from the sports background that you originally were. And I definitely come at it from a sports angle, but with a very important aspect that health is really key for athletes to be able to perform. So we're definitely not going to agree on everything, and I'm kind of aware of that. But I think my worry was that when particularly the questions around female health were put to you, you went down the road of PCOS, which is a very different scenario to hypothalamic amenorrhea. And I think I just wanted to really clarify for the audience, because so many of the people that we see and the messages I get are from women who've been wrongly diagnosed with PCOS. And, this whole kind of situation around, well, if you remove carbs, it's going to sort your hormones out. Well, actually, that's not actually the case. So I guess that's where I'm at, if that kind of gives you a bit of an introduction to me and what I do.
Fantastic. And that's a great way for discussion to start. So let me tell you that the diet I prescribe, the most important effect it has in women is promote fertility. I am daily told by women, I was told I will never have children because I was infertile. I went through fertility treatments. I went on your diet for 3 months, 4 months. I'm now fertile. I'm now pregnant. And people are named Timothy or David or Noakes because of that. And I promise you, that is one of the biggest feedbacks we get from overweight women who change their diets to increase the fat content. The key is the fat content for hormones, in my opinion, less than carbohydrate.
I think we know that fat content is important for steroid production, and that's what estrogen and testosterone are. But actually, in terms of hormonal regulation, in terms of getting the LH particularly to be at a level where it allows for ovulation to occur, that's actually directly linked to carbohydrate availability, but also absolutely linked to body fat percentage. So you're talking about overweight women who absolutely may well need to have changed their nutrition appropriately, but it won't necessarily be the fact that they've changed their diet as such. It might be that the diet has led them to improve their body composition, which will then improve their hormones. But we're working with individuals where their normal weight or sometimes underweight, or even sometimes where they are a normal weight and they're eating a higher percentage of fat, but actually their hormones are completely flatlined. So these are two quite different scenarios. And I think this is not about dismissing what you're saying or that what your work does. It's actually just about making sure that when we are putting information out there on a podcast like this, that actually we provide a very balanced argument, because I think there are so many individuals that are so confused by all the mixed messages around nutrition all around the world. And I think it's really important that we clarify that there's a big difference between actually, PCOS that has been diagnosed by the Rotterdam criteria, absolutely, and then women who are going through hypothalamic amenorrhea as a result of low energy availability.
But how do you know that? How do you know it's low energy?
You can tell from the blood test results. I mean, how
do you know that they haven't got some genetic bias? So the problem is, if we go back 15 years ago, we had lots of people with what the condition you're describing, and they were eating high carbohydrate diets. They weren't eating high fat diets. So how is it now all of a sudden that this population, which previously was eating a high carbohydrate diet and developing the symptoms you described, which are serious, I understand that, but now we're telling us, no, it wasn't the high carbohydrate, it's not the high carbohydrate diet that's causing it, it's a high fat diet. But let me just clarify, PCOS is a marker of insulin resistance, and insulin resistance is treated by a low carbohydrate diet. So I think we have to, that's absolutely true. And PCOS is best treated by restricting carbohydrates. The evidence, in my view, is clear. So let's clarify that if you're obese and you want to lose weight and you want to become fertile, eating a sugar-addicted, ultra-processed food diet is the problem. And you need to start eating real foods and cut that stuff out, and you're much more likely to become pregnant. That's that population. The PCOS population, wait a second. Now you're introducing an amenorrhea group. We are totally different population, and we don't know what are all the factors causing the amenorrhea. We don't know what they are. You've decided it's a low carbohydrate, it's the absence of carbohydrate in the diet. And it may well be, I accept that, it may well be, but it might be other things.
I haven't decided that. The research out there, if you look at the work by Kate Ackerman, the work by Luke, the work by Nikki Kay, if you look at all the work by the IOC, I haven't decided this. This is well-researched information that is telling us that. And to go back to your point
Hold on a second. You're quite right. I haven't read the literature, but I wouldn't trust anything that comes out of the IOC because their nutrition advice is controlled by industry. So they're going to push a high carbohydrate diet.
But
and they're going to find these things.
But Tim, you cannot deny the fact of actually, when you look at physiology, particularly when it comes to performance nutrition and performance in general, you can't change physiology. We know, Louise Burke has been doing this work for years. Her and her husband, John Hawley, they wanted to prove that you could improve your performance through for a high fat diet. They tried so many years, but they couldn't, because they know.
Okay, sorry, just wait a second. This is an article I've just submitted. When I started this article, I was asked, what is the evidence that dietary macronutrient composition influences exercise performance? A narrative review. I concluded, I looked through all the history, and I can tell you why I concluded this. There is no difference between a high carbohydrate or a high fat diet. The performance differences they're not present. Louise Burke's studies, and Louise and I know Louise extremely well, her studies on the race walkers are unfortunately flawed by two things. Firstly, they're not randomized controlled trials. And secondly, the athletes became hypoglycemic during the control trial, during the high fat diet trial. They restricted the amount of carbohydrate the group could ingest during the trial. Now, why did they do that? And what I can tell you from all the literature, and I've been studying it for 40 years, is that what slows you in exercise is hypoglycemia. A low blood glucose concentration is what slows you down. As long as you don't get a low blood glucose concentration, your performance will be the same whether you eat a high carbohydrate diet before exercise or a high fat diet. Interesting. So here's the conclusion. Now, it's not what Louise Burke says. It's not what Tim Noakes says. These are meta-analyses, and meta-analyses are considered the gold standard of reviews. So, two recent meta-analyses conclude, overall, the majority of null results across studies suggest that a low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet does not have a positive or a negative effect on physical performance compared with a controlled diet. And moderate to vigorous intensity exercise experiences no decrements following adaptation to a ketogenic diet. That's what the meta-analyses show. And if people say it differently, they're wrong. And why it's important is because this blanket statement that everyone should eat a high carbohydrate diet is killing people.
Well,
it nearly killed me. Hold on, wait a second. It nearly killed me because I've got insulin resistance. And if you've got insulin resistance and you eat a high carbohydrate diet, you're in trouble. I developed type 2 diabetes.
But you're saying
wait a second. I reversed my diabetes by eating a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. I know that diabetes is reversible. And if we're going to tell the population of the United Kingdom or the United States of America, in which 80% have metabolic abnormalities, if we're going to teach them to eat a high carbohydrate diet, because Louise Burke and John Hawley say that that's what athletes should eat, we're in trouble because we're going to promote diabetes. And that's the focus. We need to say diet makes no difference to exercise performance. That's what the meta-analyses show. The diet you eat chronically makes no difference. That's what the evidence shows.
But I think, again, you have blurred the lines because you're basically saying that everybody that eats a high carbohydrate diet is going to develop insulin resistance, which
I never said that.
But that's kind of what you're implying. And you're also implying that we should all eat in a particular way. And yet, actually, you've removed any sort of variation to the fact that our lifestyles are all different, our genetics are different, our upbringing can be different. So actually, I don't think I don't think there is a one size fits all. And that is something that I always say. There is never a one size fits all because there isn't. And, there are many of us who eat carbohydrate in our diet. We probably don't eat the very highly processed high sugar. And I think that's where we are in agreement that there are certain types of carbohydrate that can cause more problems longer term. And again, it's lots of cans, it's not will always. And I think you have to be really, really careful with the language that we use because, from work I do, the problem is that when we are very polarized in our view on nutrition, we then cause real black and white thinking in the population, and we end up with actually extreme problems on both ends. You're very much focusing on obesity and diabetes. I'm very much focusing on people having a healthy relationship with food and exercise, but also that they create a balance, and that actually don't have longer term consequences based on the fact that their estrogen and testosterone, as two examples of hormones, are affected because they're not eating sufficiently for the amount of training and work they are doing. So to a certain degree, we're never going to agree because we're on two very different pathways. But I think the thing that is what worries me about what you're implying is that carbohydrates don't have a place in human life, and actually they do, and in certain situations they are important.
Okay, well, you present a classic straw man argument. And what a straw man argument does is if you can expose the guy as being false in one way, then you don't have to listen to anything he says. I have never, ever, ever said that there is one diet. Yet, that's how I was taught when I did medicine and when I did sports science. I was taught there's only one diet for you, and it's high carbohydrate. So now I'm getting accused of doing what the other people are doing. I could pick up an article by Louise Burke or John Hawley, which says there is only one diet for the athlete. But so I said that's a classic straw man argument because I do not promote a single diet. Yet I was raised in medicine and in sports science on one diet, the high carbohydrate diet. And you quoted Louise Burke and John Hawley, and I've read everything they've ever written. And they have a single diet, and that is high carbohydrate. They now have changed it so that you can now periodize the diet. So there are times when you can eat more high fat. But the basic statement is still it has to be high carbohydrate. I have never said that everyone has to eat a high fat diet. I have said if you have insulin resistance, like me, and you eat a high carbohydrate diet, you're going one way. And you're going to get one of many different diseases. So is there a place for carbohydrates in the diet? I don't know. Maybe there is. But what I do know is that your genes are critically important. And if you've got insulin resistance like I have, the diet, bias to eat a high carbohydrate diet is toxic and will ultimately cause harm. So I agree with you that there is a role for carbohydrates if the individual does not have insulin resistance. And they can probably eat what they like, and it may be healthy for them. But our problem is we promoted a one-size-fits-all diet for people who are unhealthy, and we thought that the exercise could keep them healthy. I thought that. I ran 70 marathons. I thought this will keep me healthy. I developed type 2 diabetes, and I see it everywhere. And go to the London Marathon and see how many people have visceral obesity, because visceral obesity is the killer. Visceral obesity means you've got insulin resistance and you've got hyperinsulinemia. And the hyperinsulinemia will cause you to get diabetes, cancer, dementia, all those things in the long term. So what we really need to do is go and look at all the people who are running the London Marathon and see how many of them are healthy. How many of them do not have insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia?
Tim, do you know what percentage of people do and don't have insulin resistance? Do we know what percentage of people do and don't have insulin resistance? They estimate
in the United States, in the adult population, it's about 80% in the adult population. If you go to the children, it's going to be much less. But in my view, I was insulin resistant already at 25, 26. I've got the data. I was profoundly insulin resistant. I then ate the high carbohydrate diet, and that kicked me over. And I would have become diabetic, I think, even on a relatively good diet. So I think that there is a group who are genetically very disadvantaged, like myself. But then there's the other group who are not as bad, and they will take till they've got to 60 or 70 before they present with their diabetes. But we've got children at the age of 3 with type 2 diabetes. So that the genetic bias is incredibly big. So to recapitulate, if the people are lean and they're not viscerally obese and they don't have insulin resistance, they can eat what they like, and that would be the best advice. And those are the people you're dealing with. Renee, yeah. You're not dealing with people with visceral obesity, which I am, and so that I understand the difference, but don't accuse me of saying that I just promote one diet. I promote one diet for the people insulin resistant because they're not getting that message. and they're dying as a result, and that's what worries me.
I think when no one's in huge well, there's certainly different sides of the table, but actually I think we've just identified two different subsets who need to.
I think that's it. I think I mean I am not saying that I completely agree with Tim in the sense that if someone has insulin resistance, we have to do something about it. I think there is a role in those situations for a high fat, lower carb diet, but actually it doesn't necessarily have to be ketogenic. It can be a lower carbohydrate diet, and it can be different types of carbohydrate, because we know that also things like, for example, beans and pulses have carbohydrate in them, which are lower in glycemic index, but they also have soluble fiber, which is something that's really important in terms of your gut biome. And that's another whole area of nutrition that cannot be overlooked, because we're seeing more and more links with gut biome and mental health, gut biome and immune health, gut biome and overall health. So we can't, and it's a new area. There's a lot more research required, but we're definitely seeing big links, and that the gut biome has a big role to play in our overall health. So I'm not disagreeing with aspects of what Tim says at all. I think my concern was in the last podcast that it came across, and maybe that wasn't your intention, Tim, and I don't think it was from what you're saying to me, but it came across that nobody should be eating carbohydrates. Women are going to be more fertile if they eat higher fat. And actually, that's not also the case. Like there are, and I think this is my message that I try and get out to the world if I can, is that there is a lot of information out there on nutrition. There is no one size fits all. And the thing we have to remember is that not everything that is put out there is relevant to us. And it's actually identifying who we are as individuals, what our needs are, and then what is relevant to us, and then choosing the appropriate nutritional approach according to that. And that is very much my message. I am not about, we all need to eat tons and tons of carbs and loads of sugar. I'm not anti it either, as you know. I mean, I am somebody who does consume carbs. I do have sugar, and I also consume alcohol, and I have no issue with any of it. And I have a very healthy relationship with food and exercise, and I'm very healthy, full stop. I don't have an insulin resistance because I've had it checked recently, and I don't. So I'm lucky if in that case. But I think it's really important to appreciate that we cannot scaremonger everybody into thinking that they may get insulin resistance if they eat too much carbohydrate, because that's also not strictly true. And I don't think that's what you're saying, Tim, but I think it's just important how we get this messaging across. And I suppose that was really my big concern. I mean, David and I have done podcasts previously on hypothalamic amenorrhea and hormones and the importance of nutrition and what you need to have a healthy, particularly menstrual cycle, and what that means. So, this is not about this. We're not talking about that specifically, but I guess when that podcast came out, I was inundated with messages particularly from female athletes saying, this feels really wrong. This is not what this is. This doesn't fit with what my story has been. Have I done something wrong? And of course, David and I get on. I was concerned, and hence raised the concern.
Fantastic. I think we've had a great discussion, and I think we've isolated the issues. And the issue, from my point of view, is that I'm talking to insulin-resistant people, and they are the majority in the world. I'm not talking about athletes. My interest is not just athletes. It's and the public has been misled for the last 50 years that it's safe for them to eat a high carbohydrate diet, and it's not. And that has been driven, and it's not just a high carbohydrate, it's exactly what you said. It's the high ultra-processed food, and that's coming from industry. So eating ultra-processed foods is not going to help our health. So that we agree on that.
Yeah.
And I just use the insulin resistance as the fact that it may not be the insulin resistance. It could be the ultra-processed foods by themselves are so toxic that even if you're not in, but if you're insulin resistance, it just becomes more obvious. That's the one population. I do not deal with amenorrheic athletes, and I can understand that I'm not an expert there. And if you are convinced that carbohydrates are essential and that they reverse amenorrhea, that's fine, because that is a separate population. What I do know in obesity, you've got to have fat in your diet if you want to have good menstrual function. And I've seen too much of the evidence for that, the clinical evidence for that. So and just the point is, I do not promote, and I don't scaremonger. All I know is that I wish someone had told me 50 years ago, Dr. Noakes, don't eat high carbohydrate diet. My life would have been very different. I would have been more successful in athletics, and I wouldn't have type 2 diabetes. And no one told me that. I promoted the wrong diet as a consequence. And it's only in the last 10 years when I realized I was in trouble. I should be dead, incidentally. My dad died 10 years after the diagnosis of diabetes. I've had my diagnosis for over 10 years. I should be dead if I was following his genetics. And so we had a discussion the other day. If the local hospital, 300 of the 900 beds are filled with people with diabetes, that's it. It is the most catastrophic disease. And we have to recognize it. And I think it's a dietary disease. And that's why I'm motivated to do what I do.
Well, that's a really nice ending for the conversation of all three of us. Tim, what's your timing like? Because I'd love to go into your views on COVID and things, but I'm aware.
Carry on, please carry on.
Cool. Yeah. Is that all right, Renee? Thank you so much for coming on.
No, my pleasure. And yeah, like I said, it's a pleasure to meet you, Tim. And
thanks,
yeah.
Renee.
And good luck with the rest of the conversation. I'm definitely not getting involved in COVID, so I'll leave you. All right, take care, and
see you
soon.
Thanks,
Take care. Bye.
See you, Jan. Really. The trouble as an individual, actually, it's quite hard to fully understand unless someone goes through and reads the scientific research, which you'd suggest a lot of it actually is as an intrinsic bias. Anyway, to try and get nuanced messages out there to people who are so varied, like, do you feel that your viewpoint has been misconstrued during the last 10 years?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you went to the trial, much of what Renee said has been said about me in a bigger picture. So it's not criticism that is new to me. This has been the major response of the dietetics profession was exactly as Renee presented it. And I understand why. She's trained to believe certain things. And I came along, I'm not trained a nutritionist, and I discovered that I didn't believe all that stuff. The model was different. For example, she spoke widely about the biome. Well, that evidence is still accumulating. We don't know how important the biome is. Critically important, but we don't know what is the best diet for the biome. And what will happen is Tim Noakes will tell you, if you want a good biome, you must eat a high-fat diet. And Renee will say, if you want to be healthy, you must eat a high-fiber diet with lots of carbs. And who knows who's right, because we don't have the data. But it's because of our models. Because I believe that the higher fat diet's healthy, and Renee believes that the high carbohydrate diet is healthy. And we will both clutch to whatever straw we can find, whatever straw, to bolster our argument.
And do you think would you say that because and this again is maybe misconstrued as well, because when I first heard about your viewpoint and what happened to you, it was very much presented to me as it was all people should have a high fat diet. Was that ever the case, or have things changed at all? Or
nothing has ever changed. So the most recent book, The Eat Right Revolution. So what is the eat right? What is the right foods? The right foods are real foods that are not ultra processed. And no one can argue with that. The ultra processed food industry is the problem. That's what's really caused the obesity diabetes epidemic. And some of the experts will tell you that ultra processed foods are not foods, they are a drug, and they are designed to make you addicted. And who's producing the ultra processed food? It's the tobacco industry, using exactly the same techniques that made us all addicted to cigarette. Not all of us, but that addicted the world to cigarettes. It's the same industry using the same impressions. So when we talk about eat right, it's don't eat ultra processed foods. Don't eat sugar, full stop. And no one can argue with that. So if you call that my one diet fits all, it's not true. Now, if you happen to analyze that diet, it will be higher in fat and higher in protein. But it's also a nutrient-dense diet, and that's ultimately what you need to eat for. You need nutrients. You don't need calories, you need nutrients. And so these low-calorie diets, which cause amenorrhea, are all nutrient deficient. So it could well be that the amenorrhea is not because there's too little carbs, it's because there's too little nutrients in general. So that's the point I was trying to make to Renee, that she doesn't know that it's purely the carbohydrates that are the problem. Because the diets that people eat, the female athletes with amenorrhea, are so poor. They're so nutrient poor that it could be any number of nutrients that are missing. So to say that I promote one approach, it's true. I promote a diet of real foods. That's it.
Now, one of my genuine worries, because I absolutely agree with you, there's a huge issue with diabetes that needs to be addressed, and with people's relationships with food, and with the food industry. So, you know, I truly believe that your message is a very important one. But what we've seen recently, particularly when we put a post out for questions, a lot of the people will just dismiss all of your views because of your views on COVID, and because of your now, I assume in your view, you know, challenging what you think is wrong, and I'm, you know, I don't know enough about the situation to know either way, but do you not think that there is, realistically, as humans, we only have so much we can achieve, and also in terms of how society works, we really need to, it's more convenient for someone to pigeonhole us as a one thing or another, rather than to have multiple messaging. Do you worry that by going into areas like this, and coming out so aggressively against the scientific community on COVID, that you're potentially damaging all of the messaging of all the good you've previously done?
Yeah, because this is the greatest threat to human democracy that there has ever been. And so it doesn't matter if we lose this fight, Tim Noakes' academic career will be totally irrelevant. So this is the big fight that you have to do. And you have to ask, what have I actually said? And what do I stand for? I stand for hard science. And I can promise you, the hard science is not what is being given to the general public. And anyone who looks at it carefully will realize that there is a distortion of the science to a level that has never happened in human history. And that's my argument. You've got to look at the evidence. You've got to look at the science. I'm not telling you to do anything or to believe anything, but look at the science and how it's been distorted. And the reality is, we've been giving evidence that is not scientifically based. That I can promise you. And that's point one. Point two, this has got nothing to do with health. If it was about public health, people would be concerned to the 500,000 people in the United Kingdom who haven't been treated for cancer during the lockdown. That's the problem. What about the people with heart disease who haven't been treated? What about the children and the suicides? That's public health. And this is not about public health. It's about something else. And so my argument is that we've got to see the bigger picture. Once you see the bigger picture, you realize that the science is being distorted.
But I agree with you. Absolutely, there are a huge number of potential victims and of lives that will be affected, that we just don't see those numbers because they're hidden. But actually, isn't that just, unfortunately, one of the repercussions of politics, where politicians have to be seen to be doing whatever is at the time seen as being the biggest issue, because in reality they're almost there just to scratch the itch of societal worries, and the people that aren't getting the cancer treatment because they're not a data set that is being seen, and then it's not something that actually is seen as scary or as impactful an issue for the public, that the politicians, of course, will only realise that once they've scratched the burning itch of COVID.
So to answer that question, COVID has a mortality of 0.13%. 0.13%. That's the reality. The all-cause mortality in Britain has not gone up in the last 2 years. All-cause mortality around the world has not gone up. This is not a pandemic. A pandemic causes all-cause mortality to go up. Those are facts. And so the distortion of the evidence and making this a fear-driven panic is astonishing. This is a slightly worse flu, which unfortunately kills people in the most horrible way. And that I accept. It's a terrible way to die. But we have managed it so badly because we have not treated people immediately. You get symptoms, you should be treated. We've withheld treatment. And the mortality would be even less if there was immediate treatment. We have people in Cape Town treating patients in the most difficult conditions with essentially zero mortality. Why? Because the moment the patient gets symptoms, they start treatment. But the guidelines given by the World Health Organization is you don't treat the patient until they get in the hospital. It's too late then. The serious patients are not going to benefit. And so there's that distortion as well that we have to understand. And you have to ask why. So there are many threats to our health, but there is nothing bigger than diabetes. And the irony is that the biggest risk factor for a fatal outcome in COVID is diabetes and visceral obesity. So what the politicians should have done, and this is the point I make repeatedly, what they should have done was say, oh, we've got a condition that is selectively killing people with visceral obesity. What causes visceral obesity? Oh, gosh, it's an ultra-processed food diet. So ultimately, if this had been about population health, the authorities in Britain, in South Africa, in North America, in Europe, they would have said, this is a disease of the unhealthy. Our job is to make the population healthy. We can do that by getting them to stop eating an ultra-processed food diet, stop eating sugar, eating proper diet, losing their visceral obesity, and making themselves immune to this virus. No one said that. They should have said, we treat patients with drugs like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and vitamin D and zinc and all sorts of other things from day one. The day you get the symptoms, you are hit with this medication. No one did that. And so you have to say, so why not? So all I'm saying is that the management of the condition has been appalling. It's as if they didn't want patients to get better from COVID.
And why do you think that is then?
Well, I know why it is, but I'm not going to say it publicly because you have to read books like The Real Anthony Fauci, which the book has just been released by Robert Kennedy wrote it. And I'm through half of it already, but The Real Anthony Fauci will explain the whole thing in great detail by Robert Kennedy, who's kind of been researching this for a long time. And once you read that book, the scales fall off the eyes and you begin to see what's going on. And all I can tell you is we have to resist. We have to resist the tyranny of what's going on. And telling people, excluding me, I don't believe Tim Noakes anymore, won't follow his diet. Please, it's got nothing to do with me. Just go and study the facts. And once you've read Robert Kennedy's book, come back to me and say, Noakes, you're a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe anything you've ever said.
Well, actually, I mean, my point before was more to do with thinking we almost have to choose one battle and fight that. So it basically is your view now that actually this is the more important battle and it is still linked to the previous battle, and they both have the root cause, which is whatever this conspiracy is.
Yeah. So let's ignore the conspiracy. If you're talking about public health, what happened with COVID was not about public health. If it had been about public health, we would have said, listen, guys, this is a real crisis. It's going to overload the hospitals. And the only solution is we've got to do this, that, and the other. We've got to make you healthy. Vitamin D is critical. Get out in the sun, do your exercise, take vitamin D. No one said that. No one said that. Take zinc.
They have been saying that in the UK.
They might have started, but they weren't saying it a year ago or when the crisis started.
But I do think in general organisations are pretty slow and useless. No matter what, even if you work at McKinsey's and Accenture, there's a huge amount of ineptitude when it comes to change and speed and actual comprehension, understanding, particularly when there's different political pressures. I'm trying to think. Well, I guess I don't really know where to take this conversation because I haven't read that book. So is your viewpoint then that this is a tool being used to try and subjugate us all?
Well, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to ask you to answer it for yourselves and the audience, because you have to see, what have you lost in the last 2 years? What have you lost? Now, could you watch Liverpool playing football for a time? Now you can only watch Liverpool playing football. Liverpool's my team, by the way. You can only watch them if you've been vaccinated, and that's completely unethical. You cannot force people to take a treatment. That's against the Nuremberg Code. And that is against everything that the medical profession stands for. So you've lost control of your body, of your own body. And now it's not one vaccine, it's going to be many vaccines. And that's not going to end. So these are the freedoms that you've given up. And you have to ask, why did you give up those freedoms? And will you ever get them back? And what impact is going to have on your life going forward? Those are the real questions. It's not about just, is COVID a terrible disease and vaccination and so on? It's no.
But because I had a conversation with a friend who wasn't vaccinated, and they said, it's a slippery slope, it's the thin end of the wedge. But I take your point that it's likely we'll have more vaccinations, different strains and the whatnot, and I think that people would adhere to that broadly. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people will accept other changes, because they'd still have to go through government. They'd still are elections based on how people feel about the government, and already there's a big backlash in countries about suppressing freedoms too much. So I don't really see this. Certainly has set up a it is new that people are being forced to take vaccines, but I don't see how it's a Trojan horse to huge restrictions of other freedoms long term.
Well, the first problem is these are not vaccines. So they are experimental therapy, and that's the problem. And it's only under emergency use. But all those rules have been forgotten. And what the public have been told is that you had your polio vaccine, you had your measles vaccine, and they're perfectly safe and they're very effective, and they're smallpox vaccine, and that's absolutely true. But these are different technologies, and we don't know what the outcomes are. So people have accepted, without knowing the full truth, they've accepted that these things, it's like the polio vaccine. It's absolutely safe and there'll never be any problems. And the evidence is that is not the case. And I'm not going to go into detail, but all I can tell you is that the long-term safety of these treatments are unknown. And we have accepted that, and we've been forced to accept it without having the full information. And that is
why won't you go into detail?
Because then people say you're a conspiracy theorist and all that sort of thing. But what you need to do when you have the vaccine is ask what's in the vaccine, and ask them to list everything that's in the vaccine. And you'll see there's a lot of stuff there that no one knows quite why it's there. Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, are you saying that that's true of the vaccine in every country?
Well, there are three or four major different vaccines, and they're using slightly different biological methods to make you so-called immune. But they are being produced by the main manufacturers, and I would guess that they're using the same sort of recipe. But there's a lot of concern about what's in those vaccines, and there are some things that are not very absolutely clear what they're doing there. Now, I'm just going to leave it at that, and people need to go and find out what is in the vaccines. And when you are vaccinated, you should say, so what's in this vaccine, and what's the evidence that it's safe for me to use it?
And what's the difference then, would you say, between the vaccines of the polio and the fact that they've been proven to be safe in these? Are you saying just that we haven't had a long enough time for them to be truly understand the long-term implications on the population, or is it more to do with you think that they are using it as an opportunity to put additional things in the vaccine?
No, I'm not going to give a point of view because a lot of people are expressing their opinion. But what I will say is that the conventional vaccines like polio, smallpox, they took part of the virus and they made it either completely ineffective so that it could give you an immune response, but it didn't give you the disease. And they either gave it to you in a live form or a dead form. But it was most of the genetic material of the virus was injected into your arm. And you developed an immune response, which was very effective because it was the whole virus that you were exposed to. And so the immune response was what you would expect. It was a powerful immune response that lasts for years, decades. You know, I had measles as a child. I didn't have to have the measles vaccine. I had the smallpox vaccine. I didn't have 15 smallpox vaccines in my life, which is where we're going. Now, this thing has 27 or 29 proteins that are identified by the immune system, and you develop immunity to all that genetic material. But the vaccine only takes the spike protein, which has 3 of those components. So you only are immunized against 3 of the 27 points that you need to know. And it's similar. This is the analogy I would say. Imagine if I said, I want you to identify cars, but I'm only going to allow you to look at the three parts of the car: the tires, the spokes, and the driving wheel. How many cars would you be able to identify? Only those 3 components. And that's the problem with this vaccine or this injection. It only identifies a small part of the virus. And the virus is not stupid, it mutates. And so then you have all these variants. And all they've done is they've mutated this part of the spike protein, which now is no longer recognized. So that's the first point. But the second point is the spike protein is highly toxic in the human body. And no one appreciated that. The symptoms of COVID are caused by the spike protein. And what they're injecting you with is something that make your body produce the very protein that causes the problems in COVID.
But if that's the case, why?
Sorry?
But so if that's the case, how come that the vast majority of the population are fine having had the vaccine?
Yeah, because they're not expressing the protein to any great extent. That's what's happened to them. But those who are genetically different and express the protein more widely, or the vaccine distributes the mRNA to more tissues, are in trouble. But you need to see that there are quite a few people who have struggled as a result of this vaccine, and that evidence is not coming forward at all. I think you probably know that 105 professional football players have died either on the field or shortly thereafter, and that there is a 500% increase in deaths in professional football players in Europe following vaccination. Now that may be something else. Maybe it's another disease, or maybe it's not.
I mean, I've not heard anything to do with that, in all honesty.
But that's the problem. That's the problem. Why is the mainstream media not telling you that?
But I mean, I can't think of a single one in the UK.
Well, Sergio Aguero, his career has ended, so he's one. There may be, I don't know all the football players, but you start looking around, you'll see the reports. They're all on the social media, but they kind of don't quite get it into the mainstream media.
Sure, but I truly believe that would get into the mainstream media.
Why do you think that?
Because people are so obsessed with football.
Yeah, but who controls the mainstream media?
Well, the social media is very easily used to, and even WhatsApp and various things. It's very easy to spread information.
We'll go onto social media and see where you can find football players dead, and see what you come up with.
Okay. I mean, I'll have a look at that. But these are all just surely symptoms of having to respond very quickly to something.
But why did you need to respond very quickly to something which has a 0.15% mortality? 0.15% mortality.
If you look at the number of deaths it has caused and the fact it can be linked directly to something that is unknown before, then that I do believe they should have done something to stop COVID, because when you look at the deaths in America, it's a huge number of people.
But when you say it's a huge number, how many is it?
Is it 500,000 now? More than that?
How many people die every day in America from other diseases? It's a population of 300 million.
Yeah, I mean, it's
people die regularly. So people die regularly. What's happened is they've given us the fear of death, and death is a natural part of life, and that's what that's what has been forgotten. Death is a natural part of life.
Sure, but
people
half a million deaths.
Sorry, what's the average age of these people who have died? And it's, of course, every single death is a disaster. It's very sad. But I'm 72, and if I die, that most of the deaths have occurred in older people, and they're associated with many morbidities. And so that's the problem, that this is not a disease of healthy young people.
Yeah, I mean, and I agree with that. But then it is still, COVID and long COVID has had a crippling impact on some of my friends who are young and relatively healthy. And well, I guess I'm not informed enough about the stats, but for me, the number of people in America who have died linked to COVID is huge, given that people were in lockdown for a huge amount of that time. And so I do think it is something we needed to address, and not just stand by and say old and fat people can all die.
No, absolutely. And no one contests that. But the way they approached it was wrong. They did everything wrong, and that contributed to the problem.
Okay.
That's the issue. So let's not say it's trivial or irrelevant. It's just the approach was completely wrong.
Okay. Well, and the other thing, because you're now seen as a conspiracy theorist, which may sit well with you as a compliment, may anger you as almost being belittling of a viewpoint that should be actually given more prevalence to. Do you think? I'm really interested whether you feel you've always been an anti-establishmentarian, or whether you think you're the process of being almost rejected and having that, the response you then had from the scientific community, whether that's changed the way you view information that you seek, and also the information that you now trust and don't trust.
Yeah, absolutely. I follow the science, and I follow where the science leads me. And if I see that the science is distorted and untrue, then I won't accept it. You must understand that I read an enormous amount of material, unbelievable amounts. And I have libraries of books on all these topics. I don't make an opinion just because I think I'd like to make it and I'd like to be controversial. No, I make it because I've read the evidence. And read Robert Kennedy's book, and then you'll see there's all the evidence, and he presents it. And I just happen to know that evidence because I've followed it for the last 2 years.
Brilliant. Well, I will actually read that, especially there's an audio book. It's unfortunate that he's called Robert Kennedy, isn't it? Just for Googling. Doesn't come up at the top of the list.
You'll get his you'll get the senator, his father, of course. Yeah.
And so, where do you now see where would you say your future lies in the impact you'd like to have, and also in how much you think you can impact a society that are in many ways built to try and suppress your view?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to start rewriting Law of Running again, so that'll be working on that. And then we work through the Noakes Foundation and Nutrition Network to change opinions about nutrition advice and trying to get people to understand the problems of insulin resistance and high carbohydrate diets and the ultra processed foods. And we just keep pushing. We've trained 4,000 doctors and other nutrition experts around the world, and that has to have an impact. And so we will continue to do that because, again, it's evidence-based and the science is there, and that's what we promote. And the people respect it, and they respond to it. And it's going to take a long time. But as I told you, it's taken 10 years, and my hospital that rejected me all of a sudden is saying maybe we have to look at the impact of diet on diabetes. So that 10 years ago, I was the pariah. Now, all of a sudden, my people I have trained and the people we have supported through the Nutrition Network are being asked to come and say what they should actually be doing at the hospital. And that's going to happen. It's going to continue. Because my concern is that diabetes is the real problem in the world. And we should have addressed it, and we could have used COVID-19 to address it.
I think actually a lot of the reason why they went for the quick solution is that's just how the world is often now, and politicians especially seem to be doing something as opposed to preaching something. But do you think now that, as you say, the tide is starting to change towards the viewpoint of insulin and diabetes, that there could come a point when the scientific community in South Africa then do say, sorry, Tim, we want you back?
I doubt it. What they'll do is they'll take the next generation. Remember I said it's the leaders have to die off. And so it'll be the youngsters, the people who are in their 40s and 50s, who will come to an agreement that this is fine. And they won't have to address the people of 70 and 75 who caused the problem initially. So that's how I think it'll happen. The younger people will accept it, and they'll forget the history. The history dies very quickly, and people can hide the history extremely quickly. So it's going to happen, but we'll be forgotten. Our contribution won't be recognized, which is fantastic. As long as they change, that's all we want.
So if there's a 40-year-old South African research assistant out there currently, do you get in touch? Because we're expecting you to hand deliver Tim's apology to his grave.
So I'm not expecting it, and I don't need it. I'm comfortable, and you just as to repeat this answer, I'm comfortable because I know what the science shows. And ultimately, the science will win out. It will win out. It might take 10 years. It might take 15 years. So everything we've discussed today, in 10 or 15 years' time, people will look back and say, well, actually, that was actually correct. I've got no doubt about that. And at the moment, many people will say that'll never happen. But that's what they said about the diet 10 years ago. And now they've realized, actually, that we were right.
Well, thank you so much for coming back on and speaking so candidly. And I'll just see if we've got a couple of questions. I think we've probably covered most of them now. One of the issues, and this was a really passionate response that we got. If I can just find the email now from one of our listeners, was they felt that the way you talked about obesity was actually fat shaming, and that it was almost blaming or ostracizing the individual, and that actually that the way it was being talked about was one, very hurtful to them, but also potentially wouldn't necessarily help the individual because the shame doesn't necessarily force action. I mean, do you think that could have happened, or is that a worry for you that it comes across as that?
No, it's not at all, because I know I've helped millions of people to reverse their obesity. And if I was fat shaming, it wouldn't have happened. I am lauded in this country for reversing obesity in literally millions of South Africans. So it's not fat shaming. I'm just saying, listen, I was fat and I was diabetic. It was my fault. I was eating the wrong foods, but it wasn't just my fault. It was the fault of the scientists that I believed. And they said, you must eat this diet. And I followed it and I accepted it and didn't investigate it. But as soon as I investigated it, I realized that they were giving me the wrong advice.
Scott Kumar, the wonderful presenter of 10 Junk Miles, he'd asked, what causes the ultra lean? I don't know if you know much about that, or...
No. Oh, leaning sideways. It's probably that there's a slight imbalance in the muscularity, and during if you're just running, I presume it's in runners. I'm not sure.
Rob Shulman, who a very, very good comrades runner from the UK, he's asking, do you know what the best treatment for cramp is? Is it salt, or is it caused by low sodium, or rather salt is an ineffective treatment despite normal sodium levels?
Yeah, the normal sodium levels will be appropriate. We've studied the cramps, and cramping it's when the muscle's contracting continuously in a shortened position, and then that's when it goes into cramp. And the key is to stretch. And the only effective treatment we've ever had is stretching before, doing lots of stretching. So doing 10 or 15 minutes of stretching the muscles that are a problem. The irony is, if you put salt on your tongue, if you put salt on your tongue, it'll often stop the cramps by a mouth-to-brain effect.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So
that
actually,
was well described.
So even though... Okay, so actually it's worth almost having a salt mouthwash, but you don't necessarily need to swallow.
Exactly right, yeah.
And when you say stretching 10 to 15 minutes before, so would this be a warm-up before a big race? Or?
Sorry, I mean on a daily basis, to spend more time on the muscles that tend to cramp. But you're only going to cramp when you push it, when you run the big race. And so, of course, training is going to help. But ultimately, it's probably a protective mechanism that the muscle's saying, I don't want to continue contracting, so I go into cramp. That's an hypothesis.
Okay, so like salted crisps, delicious, can give you a short-term reprieve. Something I've always wondered, and I realise this is going against your whole diet, but bear with me if I'm being one of the naughty boys. When I know a lot of people will, just before they start racing, they'll be having a gel just at the start line, or they'll have an energy drink for just try and top up their glucose levels, in theory, just before the start of a race, and that can potentially spike your insulin. Is that something that people should absolutely avoid doing?
So it's unfortunate we haven't had time to get into this, but the article I showed to you and to Renee, what I came to the conclusion is that what the body protects during exercise is your blood glucose concentration. It defends that to the end. And once your blood glucose levels falls, that's when you get the bonk and you stop performing. But it only has to drop a little bit. And the only benefit I see to nutrition and sports performance is to make sure your blood glucose doesn't fall. That's the key. I've looked at all the studies which show that fatigue happens when you've got muscle glycogen depletion. The only problem is every single study, the blood glucose had fallen as well. And they didn't distinguish between the two. And but taking glucose before is not a good idea, because that spikes your insulin, that inhibits your fat oxidation. And what keeps you going during marathon running is fat oxidation, which spares blood glucose oxidation. It spares the liver. So the more fat you burn, the less liver glucose you burn. And therefore, you're less likely to drop your blood glucose concentration in the end.
And have you looked at, because I know Super Sapiens has come on the market recently, and I've been trying to get my head around that, whether it's actually a useful tool in it for understanding what's happening in your body. Is that something that you think would be would be useful for someone who has a carbohydrate fueling strategy?
Yeah, sorry, I'm completely ignorant about it. I don't know anything about it.
Okay, ignore that question then. And I think that might have been our last question. Well, thank you so much for coming back on. Really loved it as ever, and
Good.
hopefully, I think we've hopefully had a good discussion as opposed to an argument, which you know, can happen. If when your new book's out, let us know, because we'd love to have you back on to talk about it.
Yeah, that'll be a couple of years. That'll be a couple of years' time. But just to your audience, I follow the science, and that's what drives me. I'm not here to upset people or make them angry or whatever. I am here to challenge opinions. That's absolutely. But I'm independent, and I look at the evidence absolutely scrupulously, and I have over the years, and I tend to be right when you look at all the evidence and the conclusions I draw. And don't straw man arguments. Don't use those arguments and become ad hominem. Just look at the evidence. That's the way we move forward. And I'm not referring to you. I'm just referring to other people who may say things about me. Sure.
And I just want to clarify, because I don't actually know that phrase very well. Is straw man argument where instead of addressing the main argument, you find almost a part of it that you can prove wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. And that person never actually said it. And then you see as you see, Noakes says this, which he didn't say. And if he thinks that, he's a this or a that or the other. And therefore you can't trust him on anything else. We got to stick to the argument and stick to the facts. This argument, not the other arguments. So for each argument, you stick to this argument and you look at this evidence, and you don't stop debate. And the straw man argument immediately stops debate. It stops thinking. You don't have to think. If you can discount this guy as a mad person, which is what they tried to do me, he's a quack, don't listen to him. And then you don't have to look at the facts. You don't have to look at the evidence. And the only thing you must do is look at the facts, look at the evidence. And it doesn't matter who said it. Look at the facts.
Amazing. Well, thanks again, Tim. Good luck with writing the book.
Thanks very much.
If there's anything we can do, to help in the future with anything, do let me know.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. Lovely to
Cheers, Tim.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye. Oh, interesting. Don't do bad. Jody's not here to do a summary. I am. I think in some ways I think that was quite satisfying, actually, because part of the issue with Tim is half of what I know about what he said isn't what he said. It's how he's been misconstrued. And so I felt with that Renee interview, it was really good because they both really showed that they were talking about two very different subsets of individuals. And it seems like the jury is slightly out on some of it. But I hope you felt I did justice to the elements of, because I don't know about these conspiracy theories, and so Tim obviously didn't want to get dragged into something that was really off-piste. But I'm going to read that book by Robert Kennedy, and it hopefully you've taken from it processed foods are bad. And if you do have issues with diabetes, it's something that it is worth trying to address. But also if you're a female who is having issues with not getting enough nutrition. But let me know what you think. Has this blown your mind? Has this been very different to what you were expecting? And hopefully we've not exhausted, but we've spoken to this argument and the different viewpoints quite extensively. So let us know if you've had any change in your diets, if things have helped, things haven't. what you found interesting or contrary to your previous opinions. And hope you enjoyed it. As Tim said, follow the facts, although it sounds like that's pretty hard given that a lot of us aren't knowledgeable enough to know when a study is a study that has been tainted. Very hard to tell, isn't it? We haven't done a huge number on nutrition, but we've spoken to quite a few professors in the past. I always loved Professor Jones, Prof J. He has done a lot of studies to do with, he was the individual that found out about nitrites, and he's to blame for everyone having beetroot, but he also worked on the Nike Sub 2 project. We've interviewed him a couple of times. Those are really interesting podcasts where you will learn a lot about nutrition as well. Thanks for listening, guys. Any suggestions of future guests, let me know, because we go out and we get them. And if you can review us, subscribe, all that jazz, it really helps with our credibility, which really helps get on people like Renee and Tim, who are world experts in their field. So thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.